A man has an X and a Y chromosome, while a woman has two X chromosomes. Therefore, we do not meet biological women with XY and biological men with XX. The chromosomes express differences physically, with the most obvious example being the sexual organs. Similar to most animals, our species exhibits sexual dimorphisms, or differences between those sexes. While roosters and hens have social dynamics in their communities, humans have more complex social dynamics. Just the same as a dandelion or a dolphin, human beings are not assigned anything when we come into the world. Whether it's birth or germination, we become an active member in the physical world and are described accordingly to no choice or fault of our own. And as more mature members of that society, we simply observe the physical world and apply language to describe or communicate between people across time. The idea that people can be born one sex but actually be another because they identify differently is a strange concept that speaks to the health of the society. In one breath, the society is relatively free, as this new and unusual idea is not only accepted, but embraced through policy and social pressure. In another breath, the society seems nice, as we accept people for who they want to be and try not to judge. And in our normal day-to-day lives, we do this as we see people that act differently or have a different set of codes and morals, yet we don't make a big deal out of it because they're free to be themselves, the same way that we're free to be ourselves. But part of this dynamic is the ability to support something and be against it. And in the court of public opinion or academia, this should in theory be due to one's logic or the evidence, observations, someone's persuasiveness, or other factors that signify deep thought and the ability to communicate about ambiguous or controversial ideas. But when it comes to one's biological sex and gender, the avenues for communication are shut down in many ways, where people should not give their perspective unless they follow a set of rules or guidelines based on the opposition's idea of morality. These are examples of intimidation and coercion through the guise of positivity and acceptance. It assumes the objective of anyone challenging them is to be hurtful or offensive, neutering aspects of what they should and shouldn't say, providing additional challenges that don't relate to their arguments or points, and provide negative pressure due to the social implications, creating an environment with a power dynamic similar to a nobleman and a peasant, where the fear of retribution outweighs the importance of voicing one's opinion, basically wanting those freedoms for only those who agree or support them. And when we dive into the basics of reasoning, the entire idea of identity being so important that it can change the rules of nature, that it exists even outside of society, most arguments involving transgender people or gender identity never get out of the starting block. In a world without this corporate money and academic fraud, institutional blackballing, a world where the argument must stand on its merit alone, it simply can't. The term gender itself is only associated with sex through grammar for essentially all of history since its inception. A man desired a woman, and a woman desired a man, most typically, but some women or men desired the same sex, both sexes, or neither. Yet regardless of their sexual preference, they were still what they were born as. It's not uncommon for young girls to go through times where they take more social roles and mannerisms that are stereotypical to boys, wanting to roughhouse or play sports and explore, willing to take risks and put themselves in danger to gain experience and adventure. Quite simply, we call this a tomboy. And some of these girls continue those roles and mannerisms into their adult life because perhaps that's how they wanted to be all along, while others essentially grow out of it, developing their female anatomy and thus feeling feminine after that process. A man could be effeminate, taking the social roles and mannerisms of other women that were stereotypically associated with femininity. With more boys being raised by single mothers, the idea that they will be accustomed to and mimic stereotypically female social roles and mannerisms is arguably true. And while they may behave in certain ways, they are heavily impacted by the lack of a male role model, someone who can help them express their inner thoughts and emotions productively. These stereotypical feminine behaviors, interests, or mannerisms also don't predict that someone will be gay or straight, as we see young men develop into who they want to be when they become more independent and have responsibilities. But regardless of how they behave, who they are sexually interested in, or what their hobbies are, they still remain men, regardless of those differences. Sometime within our grandparents' or great grandparents' generation, the idea of gender began to incorporate into biological sex. Men with more feminine qualities and women with more masculine qualities were no longer seen as part of the diverse nature of each biological sex, but rather incorporated into the opposite one, only due to their societal behaviors or sexual desires. At this time, it was not embraced by the public and only pervade in niche pockets of a select few countries. So, while the start of gender identity movement or transgender movement can be traced to these times, it's important to know that it definitely wasn't mainstream. Even in the 90s and early 2000s, there was little controversy with using the term transvestite, as this was one of the terms used to describe someone who presents themselves as the opposite sex. The idea that gender was involved and that they were actually a woman or a man, opposite from what they were born, was seen as illogical and untrue by public opinion. It's important to note that gay marriage was not legal in the United States during these times, and so it's likely that the attention of gender and transgenderism was not a priority and even considered, as something like that would be seen as outlandish and potentially harm the prospects of legalizing gay marriage. Regardless, the main push for gender identity debate and transgender movement has been relatively new since roughly 2010, with one of the most important things being the removal of transgenderism from the APA's classification of mental illness, instead labeling it as gender dysphoria or an ongoing emotional distress due to one's gender. And while this may seem accurate, as most of us aren't mental health professionals or researchers and should trust those who have more authority in those fields, basic reasoning pokes vast holes into the research by these heavily funded and highly esteemed organizations. As in 2012 and even today, the definition for mental illness encompasses mental, behavioral, and emotional disorders. In broader terms, things that usually cause impairments in one's daily life. For instance, when we look at generalized depression, we see that one's emotions revolve around pretty specific things: sadness, hope, lack of enjoyment, apathy. For PTSD, their daily life is impacted by negative and traumatic experiences they've seen or been a part of, creating a potential for major distress in any situation that's outside of their immediate control. Or for a phobia, someone must remain in situations where they will not encounter something, creating a constant distress at avoiding more distress. Or even in generalized anxiety, where one has an ongoing distress that they might not be able to triangulate, yet still have their daily lives affected. All of these having aspects of affecting one's life and having major implications of their behavior, emotions, and actions, making them a different person in society than they would be without these disorders or mental illnesses. All sharing the common theme of their internal configuration affecting their internal dialogue or external expressions in ways that are atypical and potentially limiting and harmful. But interestingly, gender dysphoria or transgenderism is not a mental illness, while having the common traits of this distress and the major implications it entails. It is simply a condition, which can be used interchangeably to describe mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar, schizophrenia, etc., but not transgenderism. Without a proper medium for discourse where most challenges to this classification or discussions about this topic at all are highly controlled, the intertwining of a presumption of moral authority in academia or science has created a truly wicked and spiteful institution where loyalty to the established truth is arguably the most important quality. Dissension is simply unacceptable when it's concerning conversations about these select groups who are claimed to be socially underprivileged, while the rest of America sees institutions and policy give preferential treatment and potentially harm innocent, uninvolved individuals in that process. One should have the freedom to have gender affirming surgery and care if that's what they want. Yet the preponderance that comes with the fight to make everyone seem as they want to be seen has been shown as disgusting and harmful to essentially everyone else. The willingness to smear anyone not on board, attempts to assassinate their character, and overall vitriol towards those who claim to live by science is not productive, especially when those same people are unwilling to consider challenges or participate in the scientific process themselves. And when we look at the institutions, the U.S. Department of Health, the APA, the media, the public schools and universities, the professional sports leagues, these institutions are behind these movements. While they aren't the creators, they're the funders, essentially putting the hot air into the balloon so it can float around. The same companies that have questionable responses to controversies and tragedies are all of the sudden arbiters of morality and are part of the system meant to do good. The anti-authority persons are suddenly pro-authority because authority has actually got it figured out finally. We've gotten to a point where something like pulling your hair out or chewing your fingernails or something like picking at your skin or blinking your eyes too much are seen as indicative of a mental health illness. Yet the desire and action of voluntarily removing your breasts or penis isn't. As a society, we shouldn't look at mentally ill people as shitty. It's important to have empathy for others, something that is becoming more scarce, especially in high population areas. For someone to want to make such drastic changes to their body, it speaks to an underlying uncomfortability that they have within themselves. Boys get their ears pierced to be cool or stand out and get girls, and girls wear makeup to be the prettiest or get attention and attract boys. All desires that are relatively normal, yet still speak to an underlying uncomfortability, as any person who is secure within themselves has no need to impress others or affirm what they already know. Yet piercings close up and makeup comes off. Tattoos can even be removed in today's time. But the alterations to human beings that are being done in the name of gender affirming care are permanent at worst and physically harmful at best. With common puberty blockers like Lupron being used in palliative care for dying men or sterilization of the most extreme sexual criminals, and the questionable evidence of its safety and long-term use for gender-affirming care, let alone the care that starts in childhood, why is it taboo to question this? Most people don't have and aren't willing to make time to think about things deeper than what affects them directly. The new video game, movie, concert, sports event, or whatever is enough, willing to become malleable and fit a mold, waiting to experience that bit of excitement that makes the sacrifice all worth it. The idea of transgenderism or gender identity is farcical, buying more into the stereotypes and labels that most of these activists claim to be against. Willing to dress and act like biological women and use that as a means of validating their experience, unknowingly or dishonestly representing themselves through the appropriation of stereotypes. Similar stereotypes that would largely be seen offensive in today's time if it dealt with other demographics, such as race. This is likely how it has always been, whether it's dealing with existence, relationships, politics, or whatever. The unknown can be scary, intimidating, overwhelming, and there's so much emotion involved in these things that it can be exhausting, fruitless, and wasteful, if not approached with purpose and discipline. So maybe as a society, we lack the purpose and discipline, not the intelligence or ability. But regardless, we find ourselves in similar positions with some unwilling to ask why, or question something, or voice their opinion, or be who they are. I'm guilty of this, so it's not like I'm better than anyone. And even if I was different, I still wouldn't be better, as we're all just trying to figure out how to make ourselves happy and fulfilled while succumbing to the roller coaster of highs and lows that come when we attach our emotions into this physical realm. Transgenderism is completely illogical. It doesn't make sense by any metric other than a really solipsistic approach to the world, an approach that isn't diverse or inclusive, yet presents itself as such. Regardless of the bullshit, these people are ill. They're broken just as many of us are broken and are looking to find peace and fulfillment. The gender affirming care industry has grown exponentially and is likely due to increase barring any governmental or societal checks. Pharmaceutical companies that used to be demonized by the left are now lauded as great due to their willingness to provide drugs that are thought to help affirm one's identity. Pharmaceutical companies that have their own vested interests to sell the drugs that they by law have to go through yellow tape after yellow tape to simply develop. Pharmaceutical companies that operate like any other business, seeking to validate their actions through revenue for themselves, future projects, and their shareholders. The transgender population are largely victims being sold a false bill that will supposedly affirm their identity, one that likely has long recovery times, long-term complications, and unforeseen outcomes that have not been properly examined by the medical community, who are the ones recommending, advertising, and lobbying for this. The entire operation will create a community that is even more high risk than they were before, with a high risk of premature death due to drugs or suicide. As when these surgeries heal, their internal thoughts are not likely to change, as they weren't limited by their physical anatomy. The physical anatomy only affirming that they were wrong in their thoughts. Even after these surgeries heal, the public will still largely know you're transgender because the sexual anatomy isn't the only sexual dimorphism, essentially creating a need for more affirmation because the underlying issues are regarding the person's image of themselves more so than the physical manifestation or other people's opinions. All in all, I want to know if I've been lied to. And it's hard to accept it, and it takes time to sink in, but yet in reflection, it's always nice to know that I didn't waste more time on something not worth it. When it comes to these transgender arguments, it becomes difficult as people stake a good portion of their identity within that movement and are validated through this corporate spending and lobbying across the board. Yet it's important to say what we think and be able to be incorrect. And for reasons I've stated before, it's quite difficult to do this regarding transgenderism in today's climate. These people are mentally ill and being taken advantage of by the industry supplying them care. In due time, I imagine we will look at this care the same way we look at doctors recommending Lucky Strike cigarettes, with the thought of what the hell were they thinking?